Hi everyone, my name is Grayson Jamrock. I am currently a student in Dr. Albert Barreta's HSP 730 Seminar in Tourism class. Today we are going to be doing a video essay over a research article that Dr. Barreta gave to his students to discuss the methodology, implications, and overall results of the study. So what we're going to be discussing this time around is a systematic literature review of risk and gender research in tourism. This is an article published in 2016 by the authors Elaine Chiao Ling Young, Katherine Khoo Lattimore, and Charles Arcodia. I am terribly sorry if I've butchered that pronunciation. This article specifically explores tourism and the culture of risk inherently involved therein, especially where concerns of gender are involved. The study and conglomeration of research was deemed necessary by the authors in light of what were, at the time, recent terror attacks involved within the tourism industry, specifically the 2015 Paris bombings. The authors made it pretty clear from the very beginning that violence and risk are very much separated by sex and gender. Inherently, men and women are going to perceive risk differently, because each of them is vulnerable to different scenarios from one another. The authors made a point that through studies, women have been found to be more risk-sensitive. Now, risk-sensitive just means that women have a different perception of what risk is inherently from men, so they're more likely to find different scenarios risky, and the scenarios that they happen to find risky are more common than the ones that men find risky, or the ones that they do find risky are more dangerous than the ones that men would find risky. The study showed that men are more likely to find an emotional situation risky, whereas women are more likely to find any actions that involve physical or sexual natures risky. The authors attributed the lack of perception in tourism to the fact that tourism itself is inherently a male activity, which has an interesting history in and of itself, but we're not going to go into that right now. They also said that it could simply be things that are physical in nature, such as men often being classified as being larger, heftier than women, so women are more likely to perceive the same things as a greater risk simply because they're more diminutive in nature, size-wise. This all denotes the assertion that female tourists are at a greater risk for harm than male tourists, and calls to action the need for distinctive study regarding risk management and tourism, varying on sex, as a principle. So, this study employed a systematic quantitative approach in order to gather, extrapolate, and analyze data. While meta-analysis would have been more comprehensive in the forms of quantitative data it could have generated, it was not selected for the lack of ethics in using a study that depended on comparison when all contributions to the literature varied so much. So in analyzing these studies, of which there were initially over 1,400, it wouldn't have been correct to use meta-analysis because each of these studies varied in what they applied, what kind of variables there were, the time frame, the nature of the study. It would have been like trying to compare apples and oranges. As fruits, yes, they are both that, but on a basis they are inherently different. So you would have gotten results, but they wouldn't have been correct results or apt results, which is ultimately not the goal of research. We want to be accurate and ethical. Another research analysis was considered, and that's traditional research, which would have looked at the whole picture and compared them all on the same basis. This too actually had to be tossed out because the results it would have generated would have been too general. It would have said, yes, they're both fruit, and that's all there is to it. So it would have allowed for the misinterpretation and the misrepresentation of the results denoted. It'd be a dream for people trying to prove their theory, but it wouldn't have enough concrete evidence to actually be considered accurate. Now, a systematic quantitative approach corresponds to research via meshwords, which are words of interest within each study. So they set up a database which would extrapolate from 7 different research bases, including things like LexisNexis, EBSCOhost, WebEx. It would pull these research articles and look for specific key terms, which in this case were sex and tourism as two of the primary ones. Any articles that generated would then be funneled down by the authors one at a time. So certain studies probably mentioned just sex or just tourism had to be tossed out. They wouldn't be relevant to the overall comprehension of the study. Then there were other studies that did mention sex and did mention tourism, but it had nothing to do with sex, risk, and tourism all at once. In the end, the authors managed to go down from over 1,400 articles to just 86. And of those 86, 2 more had to be tossed out because while they did deal with risk assessment and gender within the tourism industry, it wasn't the correct focus of the paper. It relied on those as outstanding outliers rather than as the central focus or variables of the study, which made them unreliable in terms of how well they would correlate with all the other data extrapolated. For the purpose of this research, there were 7 different databases used, and from each of those databases, the authors made a point to extrapolate a lot of different articles. That way you had an honest representation of all the information out there, and they could get a more complete picture for their thesis. Now, once the actual analysis was all said and done, there were a lot of really interesting things to discover upon its conclusion. The first one being that risk and tourism as key concepts within research had increased drastically in frequency since 2001. Now, my personal theory is that this was because of the attack on the World Trade Center that resulted in what we now call 9/11. However, that wasn't actually expressly stated within the study. It was just a trend that I had noticed. But it is worth mentioning that of the research conducted since 2001, the primary groups being researched and then the primary groups conducting research were all from the Western Hemisphere, specifically the United States of America, although that didn't include studies that did fieldwork. Most of the studies that did fieldwork actually resonated in Europe, which I think in and of itself yields its own kind of comprehensive study, because I would like to know what's going on with that. Now, the subject of these studies, all of the ones that were thoroughly investigated, the 84, were very diverse. Sexual behavior, travel behavior, and tourist risk behavior, the three main concepts being studied, took up more than 43.0% of all the studies. That was more than any of the other ones combined, obviously. By and large, the concept of risk was evaluated as a variable within these studies, rather than the driving force, which technically makes the studies a little bit incomplete because they weren't evaluating risk to the fullest assessment. They were using that as a reason that tourism might or might not be successful within gender roles, rather than using it as a driving force, which would have been an interesting concept to see. For instance, certain places that were more traveled to because they were riskier or less risky, making them the variable that doesn't change rather than the one that does. Just would have been an interesting thought to see explored, but it wasn't the purpose of the research, so it's certainly no criticism that didn't include it. Now, regarding the organization of the studies, gender was used as a variable more and more commonly as the years progressed. And total, the studies that included gender, more than double the studies that involved men involved women. So while men overall had 9 different studies that were dedicated exclusively to them and risk and tourism, women had 19. Which to me shows a certain increase in education with the people who are actually conducting the research, because rather than just trying to study the population as a whole, they're segmenting it, focusing more specifically on women because women have been emerged to be traveling and touring more. More and more women are entering the workforce, more and more women are breaking the glass ceiling and making more money, allowing tourism, whether it's for work or for leisure purposes. And more women are becoming researchers and actually studying this, inherently looking at the things that will affect them directly. So that was actually really interesting to see just how impactful some of these things are without even being aware of it. Then in all studies where gender risk was both observed and discussed, females in tourism were determined to have a higher risk adversity and a greater risk perception, which is being aware of the range of harm to within your of proximity, than males did. There were a couple notable exceptions that specifically studied suicidal tendencies and violent tendencies within men versus women, but those ones were actually the two that were not studied more thoroughly because they didn't technically correlate with the overall basis of the research. Many of the studies also found that the very differences that males and females perceived differed greatly within the tourism industry. Women were likely to perceive themselves as at risk, if the reason they were traveling was leisure rather than men. Men perceived themselves to be in a higher risk if they were traveling for work purposes, which again just denotes an additional study. While the study's primary focus was on the perception of Western men and women, even when it took into account different countries and different activities and different proclivities, it would yield more accurate results if there were to be an introduction of cultural pluralism, which would mean that multiple cultures, traditions, and tourism fronts were explored, diverse from sole measures of these studies that were initially examined. The 1,400, including all the ones that were tossed out previously by the research, because some of them didn't centralize around Western technology, Western tourism, Western travel, which by cutting them out of the research, you are actually losing a lot of really good and probably valid information. There were some other gaps that existed within literature, such as the laggard research articles specifically examining risk tourism as associated with gender, and studies that focused on more psychological imperative than strictly statistical analysis. So while earlier meta-analysis was tossed out because it was too technical, the study could have used a little more technical analysis to actually break down some of these numbers. They overall did indicate trends, so it was considered a successful study, but there wasn't a lot of information there. It's like comparing palettes when you've only had 2 plates. There's a lot of other plates you could have tried that you might not necessarily have enjoyed, but it would have given you a better picture overall. Now, admittedly, the authors did confess this in their paper and said that it wasn't complete research. What they had initially set out to do was overall prove in more than 70% but there's still a lot of other stuff that is necessary in order to do a more complete study. I haven't been drinking, I'm just not very good at talking in front of a computer. Overall, I actually found the studies really interesting. I thought they discussed some really relevant topics, myself being a female who travels, who is traveling right now, actually. And a lot of these were concepts I'd never really considered. Most of these are things that you think about, but you don't know that you're thinking about. So to see them all classified like this and actually analyzed and broken down by date and by relevancy was completely fascinating to me. And I would actually really like to read some of these studies that they had mentioned, just to get a better idea on what sort of risk behaviors are best engaged in and best left alone when out on the road. But to that end, this study itself I thought was relevant, I thought was interesting, I just thought I could have used a little more meat to it. Overall, I was pretty satisfied with the assignment, and I'm very satisfied you guys have made it to the end of a almost 11-minute video. I hope you've been entertained. If not, I hope you haven't cringed too much. But either way, that's all for tonight, so go get some rest, you guys. Stay safe.